Welcome to the AAS 21 podcast. I'm Eddie Glaude, and I'm the chair of African American Studies here at Princeton University. I'm delighted to have join us today Professor Ruha Benjamin. She is an associate professor here in the Department of African American Studies and a faculty associate in the program on History of Science, the Center for Health and Well-Being, the program on Gender and Sexuality Studies, the program in Global Health and Health Policy, and the Department of Sociology at Princeton. Her research focuses on the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology, race, ethnicity, and health knowledge and power. She's the author of People's Science, Bodies and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier, where she examines the social dimensions of stem cell science with a particular focus on the passage and implementation of a right to research codified in California. She has 3 new books on the horizon: Race After Technology, which examines the relationship between machine bias and systemic racism by analyzing cases of discriminatory design and offering tools for a more socially conscious approach to tech development. She has an edited volume immediately coming out entitled Captivating Technology, at least tentatively titled Captivating Technology, Reimagining Race, Resistance, and the Carceral Imagination, in which she brings together scholars who work at the nexus of critical race studies and science and technology studies. And finally, there is The Emperor's New Genes, a multi-sided investigation of how human population genomics reflects, reinforces, and sometimes challenges socio-political distinctions such as race, caste, and citizenship, with a particular focus on initiatives in the U.S., South Africa, and India. Wow. Her work reflects her wide-ranging interest and mastery of a number of different fields, and it demonstrates that at the heart of it all is the creativity of an artist at work. Welcome, Ruha.
Wow. Thank you. I feel welcome.
So let's talk about, this is amazing in terms of the scope and breadth of your work. When we talked with your colleagues, like Tara, we talked about the expansiveness of her archive and the like. And really, the expansiveness of what the subject matter and the intersections of the subject matter that you work in. So talk to me a bit about how would you describe what motivates your work? How did you come to this?
I can think of 2 things off the top of my head. One is just a stubbornness that I've had since starting in the field of sociology at Spelman College.
Yes, and big up Spelman.
And continuing on in graduate studies. The stubbornness is around when I'm told that I'm not supposed to study certain things, it motivates me to want to know why that is. Why is it off limits? And I think within the social sciences, at least when I was getting started, less so now, when it came to science, it was as if this was a rarefied arena that was off limits to critical inquiry. It was in a bubble. It was asocial, apolitical. And so that made me want to know more about it. Why is it, for example, even to this day, that when I share kind of what my general interests are, the first question often is, well, did you study that life science, or did you study that particular technology? As in, do you have the necessary expertise to even raise the question? And that response is you find it less when people are studying, say, economics or politics. People don't say, well, do you have a degree in economics? Well, were you a politician before you started down that line? Because it's seen as something that, is open to social critical inquiry. Whereas science and technology, I think the idea is that it somehow hovers above human experience. If you're a human being walking this earth, you are engaging with science and technology every day. That it sort of allows you certain kinds of experiential knowledge that I think is the groundwork. Not that you shouldn't then sort of pursue other kinds of more technical expertise, but you already have a certain expertise and experience with this arena that then should lend itself to critical inquiry. So there's a stubbornness that says, well, I'm going to do it because I'm told not to. The second motivation is that I see all around me the way science and technology has very grave life and death stakes. And I think that we need more varied kinds of expertise, more varied kinds of people raising questions, doing research that really push into the social dimensions of science and technology, so that not simply that more people can consume it and benefit from it as sort of kind of a commercial enterprise, but develop knowledge around it. I think that there's ways that that we have to sort of broaden that base of knowledge.
So so we got these two different kinds of motivations. Let's talk a little bit about this stubbornness.
Yes.
So where does it come from?
Yeah.
Right? There's this sense, I mean, I love that line at the end of your homepage where you talk about, I come from many Souths, and that you really are interested in understanding the underbelly of things, of the world itself.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about from whence this stubbornness. So when people tell you you can't do something, that you decide you will do it.
Yeah. It's hard to know where it kind of comes from. There's probably a line in terms of family experiences. My parents, for example, were very stubborn in their own way in terms of even getting married across various kinds of lines. They had to buck certain traditions and sort of throw out certain kind of scripts about what was expected of them. My dad's side of the family is originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, moved to Los Angeles. And in the 70s, he traveled with a group from Los Angeles to India, to South India, where he met my mom. And within a month, they were married. The day after they met, they decided to get married. And not simply just kind of ignoring their families, but enrolling their families and helping their families understand why they were bucking certain kinds of traditions. And so I wasn't there yet, but I have a feeling that some seeds were planted in terms of just understanding that we are social beings, but the point is not simply to follow the scripts that we inherit, but to begin to rewrite certain kind of scripts and make other kinds of things possible, both in our interpersonal lives and more importantly, on a broad base, kind of beginning to transform the narratives, whether they have to do with race or gender or class. And so I think that certainly I see as a kind of beginning point of the inheriting stubbornness.
Well, I see it in the very way in which you occupy spaces like the university, right? The way in which you move through these sorts of spaces is really important. Then let's go back to that second point about the life and death stakes of the relationship between science and technology. And we see this in your first book, People's Science. And it's a fascinating text, right, in which you examine California Stem Cells Research and Cures Initiative, Prop 71. Talk a little bit about that first book.
So in terms of the seeds of that first book, it actually started when I was an undergrad, before I even knew what stem cell research was. And I was just interested in medicine and health, broadly speaking, and how there are certain kinds of conventions about what good medicine is, who has access to it, and the life and death stakes around that. And when I was doing my undergrad research around obstetrics and Black midwifery, the tradition of Black midwifery in the South, and it's kind of comparing the more institutionalized kinds of childbirth experiences versus lay experiences where people have babies in their homes and so on, which we think is of a bygone era, but it has a resurgence. And Black midwives have continued that tradition from slavery on. And so, during that undergrad research, one of the people that I interviewed was a classmate of mine who had given birth before she came to Spelman as a teenager. She was 17. And during that experience, she was having a cesarean section, and she was semi-conscious and overheard the doctor ask her mother, while we have her open, should we just go ahead and tie her up? And so thinking about the long history of reproductive injustice that has been specifically targeted at poor women, Black women, the fact that this was in the mid-90s and still relevant, still experiencing women, still to this day, when we think about a year or two ago, the case breaking in California about women prisoners being sterilized, about a judge a few months ago offering prisoners, I believe in Tennessee, the option to have their sentences reduced if they would be sterilized. Except, so this is not something that sort of we got past. And so thinking about the role of, health practitioners, that this is not rogue scientists, things happening in the dark, right, where we think about abuses taking place, racist abuses, as the product of mad scientists or people on the fringes. What you find is when you begin to unearth this history, it's often people at the center of their fields, people getting huge awards and grants and running big institutions who have been the main protagonists of eugenic practices from a bygone era to today. And so for me, with my students, I say, we're not going to talk about this in terms of pseudoscience or kind of fringe science, because that is not doing justice to how it played out. Right. This was the science of the day. So for me, in terms of people science, I'm interested in looking at what is being funded. What are the frames by which people are buying into this and thinking this is a great idea? Let's look at the center of the action and find out how the kinds of harms and exclusions that are baked into that aren't going to sort of jump out at people. It's not going to make a headline like, racist scientists do X, because that's not how it played out in each era, right? It was people who were respected, getting, awards and all kinds of things. So I thought, okay, let me go to the center of action. So when I moved from, Atlanta for graduate school in Berkeley, soon after I got there, the state of California was pouring $3 billion into investment in stem cell research. And it just happened that one of my graduate advisors was an ethics advisor to the process. And so I became enrolled in the process at kind of insider fellow there, being trained both in the science and in the ethics. And so I began to study this qualitatively. What are the frames by which this has got the popular vote in the mid 2000s, and at the same time, what we found was the majority of people who voted saying, yes, we want to invest in this future. We see regenerative stem cell research. This is wonderful, which is, maybe it is, but at the very same time, the majority of people who voted down a bill that would have funded basic health care for the majority of Californians. That means something that we could do yesterday in terms of access to basic health care was voted down at the same time that a futurist vision of what this science could produce got all the resources. And so for me, is those types of tensions and juxtapositions, how innovation and inequity can go hand in hand. They're not necessarily working at odds. Right? And so it's precisely that kind of tension that then is continuing to animate the current work.
So let's talk a little bit about methodologically how you attack that problem. There's a sense in which, you ran past it pretty quickly, but you said you were part of the first training cohort. So you're actually learning the science.
Right. And so that's right.
And then there's this insistence on keeping track of social structure, understanding historical context, right, as you're actually doing the science. So talk a little bit about the methodological intervention you're making in order to pursue this line of inquiry.
Right. And I think I'm not inventing a new methodology, but it's really about bringing together existing methodologies,
right? Kind of move, right?
A sort of multi-methods, really grounded in qualitative approaches, but an insider approach, trying to understand this from the perspective of the actors that I'm studying as being. So participant observation is one of them. So to developing, in-depth field notes, interviewing as many people as I can, then triangulating that with a kind of archive of media and documents that are being produced around this initiative. And so it's trying to pull together the various strands. And also, I think one of the things that I'm trying to do then with people science and continue to do is to study what is not even raised to the surface as obvious kind of people you could talk to or archives. That is, studying what's not being talked about. How do we study the absences, the gaps? And so one of the things that people science tries to do is to stage a debate among various constituencies and actors that never actually happened because the initiative was passed so quickly and with such pomp and sort of hype, if we will, that certain kinds of debates and frictions never even raised to the surface, never even happened. So the book tries to put people in conversation and perspectives in conversation that I think should have unfolded so we could see the various sides and see how certain frictions could have been. So it's interesting. As part of the process, one of the recurring themes in the meetings, in the conferences, in the classes around the ethics of stem cell research or any field is the problem of conflicts of interest. Okay, so this idea that people are sitting on a citizens board making decisions, who are the directors and the people who are running the very same institutions that are going to get money from this agency, right? And so it's how can you be a recipient and also be the decision maker around this. So conflict, it was a recurring. How do we deal with this conflict? And for me, what was most absent is the lack of conflict when it came to some basic frameworks. The idea that, for example, when it came to, how this entire thing is going to affect the disparities in healthcare that already exist, right? There's some of the main protagonists of the initiative just saw it as an impediment to worry about those types of things. They would say, well, companies are going to want to invest in this field if we put in these requirements. We never heard a full-fledged disability justice critique of stem cell research as part of the unfoldment of it. So a lack of conflict when it came to some basic frameworks and norms around the science is what the book tries to lay out and to say, going forward, the next time this is on the horizon, if these types of issues aren't debated and aren't part of the public discourse around that, then we can't really, then we're giving lip service to ethics. We're giving lip service to the politics of it. It's, it's basically where bioethics becomes a handmaiden to science. It's basically clearing the way to let this, but not really raising pointed questions and critiques, right? That should be part of the conversation.
And so the takeaway, and this is the first book, and it inaugurates this kind of line of inquiry that has in some ways defined the boundaries of your research agenda in very interesting ways, although you're not bound by those boundaries. But there's this kind of underlying political sensibility driving how you approach it. I remember reading the chapter 6 and this insistence on the essential elements of what you're calling a participatory science, right? And to my mind and to my ear, this rings of a kind of democratic sensibility. So talk a little bit about the takeaway from this mixed method, this multi-methodological approach where you're looking at what's the gaps and the implications of those gaps. So what
right.
participatory
Thank you for
science?
that question. Yeah, I think that the knee-jerk response to people who know something is controversial here, something is not right here, so how do we deal with it, is to invoke the rhetoric of inclusion. So we need to include as a kind of, vague multicultural platitude, right? And so, and often this inclusion is something that is imagined to happen after everything is said and done, right? We're going to get all of this framework in place, this science in place, and then we'll include you. Often the imagined actor that is being included is a consumer, a downstream that will then be included in the marketplace of scientific and medical goods. And my vision of participatory science is much, much further upstream, before the table is set, before the money is invested, when the agenda is, even just a seed. There needs to be a basis there in which conflict can happen, in which different possibilities for how to invest, for example, $3 billion, right? That level of participation, it has implications for K through 12 education, for example, actually cultivating citizens who can meaningfully debate and raise their concerns, and institutions that can have that kind of decision making and input. And so much of what we're talking about could be seen as kind of a rarefied thing in terms of regenerative medicine, but more and more I see the implications as starting pre-K. If we want something called participatory science with respect to stem cell research or genomics, then we have to look at what we're doing in the classroom at the very early level in terms of cultivating a kind of civic democratic sensibility that I don't think it's just about individual attributes, but about the institutional frameworks that would allow that to happen. Right?
It makes sense. I mean, these folks are doing this stuff in labs that will have an impact on the day-to-day living of folks.
That's right.
And to kind of claim it as separate when it's always already involved in the actual lives of people.
Absolutely. And what happens is lip service towards that greater impact is often there at the grant making when you're trying to get a grant, when you're trying to win public support, then the implications are broad. Then this is going to impact everyone. But as soon as everyone, or at least some set, wants to have a meaningful sort of input, then the gates come up in terms of the boundary between
objective science, expertise.
Right. And so that it's a very porous boundary when when it benefits the people doing the science or soliciting the grants, then implications are broad. In fact, National Science Foundation has requirements that to get a grant, you have to express how this is going to impact all of these different groups. But then in the day-to-day, workaday kind of environment, that space is seen as asocial, apolitical, right? And so that's what we have to question is what, that the kind of strategic use of democracy, strategic use of social impact, and who it benefits ultimately.
I think that's a great transition to the new edited volume coming out with Duke. It's captivating technology. I mean, where you edit this, you gather this extraordinary group of scholars to think about, the complex intersection of critical race studies and science and technology studies. The aim of which is what?
Yes.
I mean, what do you take this edited volume? What do you take its aim and objective to be?
So I think there's a few things going on. One is a way in which I'm asking us all to think about our ideas about what racism is, how it operates, how it's reproduced. I think what I'm trying to do is to show how innovative racism is. It's not a backwoods ideology. It's not something that just happens, in terms of nooses and signs and, racial slurs. I want us to look for how racism is coded into the things that we see as modern, as postmodern, as part of our future. And so there's a sensibility I'm trying to cultivate that has us look for it in different places, not simply on a Texas highway where a Sandra Bland is unjustly targeted, but look for it in our textbooks, look for it in our new policy documents, look for it in the visions for smart cities. Because I think, and I'm not saying look away from the kind of the obvious, but let's look at the way that it's coded, and not simply coded as metaphor, but coded literally into our computer infrastructure. So within the social sciences, we have this idea of structural racism, or the way in which inequality is structured into the fabric of our lives, whether it be in legal codes, economic codes. And what I'm saying is, let's also look at computer codes, right? And so much that's happening in terms of the new Jim Crow or carcerality, broadly speaking, that critique is now well known in terms of mass incarceration, the way it is a human rights crisis of our time. So there's various kinds of responses and reforms and things that people are trying to do to make it less harsh, right? And so much of that reform is technologically mediated, whether we have to do with ankle bracelets, whether we have to do all kinds of new gadgets and systems are being developed to manage the crisis. And what I'm saying is, and what the volume is trying to do, is to show how, this is a new Jim Code, we might say, right? It is the coupling of automated systems, all kinds of technological infrastructure that has these built-in biases, but coupled with the notion that this is more objective than a previous era. So it's that coupling of deeply encoded, much more subtle forms of bias with the allure of objectivity that then makes it seem, because so much of it is presented like this. Well, yes, we know these judges are racist. Yes, we know these officers. So let's take it out of their hands and let the computer decide whether you should go on for parole. Let's let the software decide how long you should do this, and so on. And so whether it has to do specifically with carcerality, but what the volume says is, we're even shortchanging our critique if we stop with obvious forms of incarceration in prison and policing, because these same technologies are being used for to determine creditworthiness, are used in hospitals, are used to decide whether to hire or fire teachers, are used in all kinds of domains of social life that are not about simply prisoners and policing. And so the same kinds of biases that are festering here are basically then penetrating all areas of social life, but seen as more objective.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking as you were talking, Ruha, about a recent New York Times piece about how the NYPD is trying to use predictive policing, right? Using various kinds of formulations to kind of anticipate where crime will happen, when it will happen, almost an attempt to fulfill Minority Report. Remember that movie with Tom Cruise?
Absolutely.
And then I was thinking about that in relation to, this is me jumping around because
please.
it's so generative. Thinking about Black Mirror, right? The Netflix series where you see this attempt to think through the complexity, the moral ambiguity of technological advance. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And so it's precisely that question of what is our ethical, political relationship with technology. And so this next stage of work, both Captivating Technology and then the next book that's going to come out, it's not saying to turn our back on technology. It's to say, so in the same way that with our children, if you don't talk to your children, process racism and inequality with your child, they will inherit the default settings. Their worldview, the way that they see, it's going to mirror the status quo if you don't process it with them, right? Similarly with our baby robots, I see a certain kind, we have to raise our robots ethically, politically, with a certain kind of sensibility. Otherwise, they will inherit the default settings that have to do with these forms of bias. And so what we're trying to engender through this volume and through the next book that I'm working on is how to cultivate this kind of ethical, political relationship, not to turn our backs on it, but also, and which is the dominant paradigm, not to assume that it's going to magically solve all our problems. So much of our crisis with respect to incarceration and other social problems are being outsourced to technology. We're saying, let the software figure it out. We're so bad at this. We're so subjective. We know we're biased. All the discourse about implicit bias, right? So that in many ways is an escape hatch. It's saying, we're not going to deal with it. We're going to let this do. But we have designed this. This doesn't float out of the air, right? Our worldviews, our norms and biases and existing inequalities are mapped onto this when you deal with predictive policing. So much of the justification we're no longer policing people, we're policing geographic space. These places that are high crime, that gets folded into the algorithm, so it justifies you spending more time there, questioning more people, stop and frisk or whatever. How do you think that place got like that? Our geography does the work of laws of a previous era in terms of codifying inequality and racism. And so if we use geography as a basis for this new round of decision making, we're mapping it right into it, right? And so this is the idea that we need historians, we need literary scholars, we need social scientists to be part of the design and imagination process. It's too important to leave it simply to the technologists and the people who have the technical expertise, because all of these other sensibilities that would raise the question about the history of, that's never raised, right? Only after the fact, it's like, oh, whoops. So Facebook last year before, got called out because when we're online, we get these targeted ads on the side. And so ProPublica did an investigative report and showed how if you're a business and you go and you want to buy an ad, you can, according to the way that the algorithm, way that the forms are set up, you can exclude particular racial groups from seeing your ad. So if you have a housing ad and you don't want these Black and Latino customers to see your ad, you can you click a few things and they won't see your ad. So it's a kind of high-tech redlining that then people are so surprised at, and it's kind of thing where, well, you could have seen that coming if you had certain kinds of expertise being, part of the process.
So, this takes us to the, you mentioned the new work. You have Race After Technology, and you have The Emperor's New Genes, and both of those books are amazing in their initial stages. I mean, I'm thinking about race after technology, particularly in the context of the debates and anxious debates around AI, right?
Yeah.
I mean, artificial intelligence, I mean, we're talking about coding and computers.
Yes.
I mean, artificial intelligence, those things,
Yeah.
that's like Model Ts compared to what's coming down the pike, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's a technological revolution that's happening now.
That's right.
So talk a little bit about how these previous racial regimes and the knowledges that flow from them are shaping, you've already alluded to this, are shaping, right, these technological advances and how your work intervenes in this.
Yes. So I've seen, even in the last year and a half, these kind of waves of public sensibility going from kind of shock that these, AI and our I call them our racist robots, a kind of shock around our racist robots to a sensibility like, of course they're racist, because more sensibility around the design process. But now I see more and more, both from the commercial side and the social justice side, a real genuine grappling that what do we make of this? How do we design differently? So, for example, there was an inaugural conference back in November at MIT that was a confluence of activists and technologists and social scientists and all kinds of community organizations called Data for Black Lives. And this was, this is part of an attempt to think about how to marshal artificial intelligence and automated decision making in ways that can be more revealing of racist structures rather than sedimenting them. So it's a way of trying to use and redesign technologies for social justice, right? And so this is work that is not going to come from one or two books. It's part of ongoing collaboration across different sectors and expertise. And so I am heartened after this kind of wave of acknowledgement that there are people that are actively trying to think up projects, and projects were presented there having to do with housing and finance and healthcare, where people are using automation and artificial intelligence in ways that I think are supportive of social justice and equity, right? And so I would encourage those who are listening to go visit the Data for Black Lives website and to consider, it's an annual conference now, but it's not the only space. There are a number of other initiatives around justice-oriented design, right?
I think this is a really important point because, there's this kind of ongoing skepticism or worry that technological advance will lead to the destruction of human life. Right? We've seen it in the literature, folks, iRobot, these sorts of things. Right?
It's our anxieties around
so it's
that.
important to say that, no, this is a site for us to actually do justice work.
Absolutely. And so we think about, there's the concept of technological determinism, this idea that the idea that technology will save us, but the idea also that technology will necessarily doom us, both are technologically deterministic. It's as if we have no agency. We're either going to be completely helped or completely harmed. We are just pawns and puppets. And that's not actually, nor is it a productive way of thinking, but it's not actually how it works. We are agents of this, right? And so I think about, especially for in terms of Black community and culture, we have always been technologists, whether it has to do with music, whatever it has to do with. This is not something that is external to Black culture and Black life, right? Many of the ways, the innovative practices that, we have engineered have been appropriated and seen as coming from some other source or been ignored or not valued. But I think reorienting ourselves to technology, both in terms of the tradition of being inventors of various sorts and not simply in terms of material goods. But one of the things the second book, Race After Technology, is trying to do is to broaden our sense of what counts as technology and invention. That our social relations and the way that we interact are sites of invention, are sites of remaking and reimagining the world. And so I don't want to us to conflate innovation with simply material invention. That is one site, but I think that we limit ourselves when we.
I mean, you just mentioned a word, and it's a word that that is so critical to what I get from reading you, reading your work, and watching you, inhabiting space with you, and that is imagination. Mm-hmm. I'm fond of saying that, of quoting this passage from this sentence from Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says that God speaks to us through our imaginations. Mm-hmm. And I always say to my students, if that's true, then what is the devil doing?
Yes, right? I love that.
So imagination becomes a kind of critical category for you in how you, even as you're describing and doing all of this work, imagination comes back all the time. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think one of the things.
That's why I called you an artist in the beginning.
So what is a personal side to this, and that is the experience of feeling like my imagination and creativity was squashed through the process of graduate training. That it was an experience of the more expert I became, the more scholarly I became, I felt also the pressure to cut off parts of myself. It was a kind of amputation that meant fitting into a very narrow sense of what it means to be a thinker. And so postgraduate work, being a teacher especially, has been a space for me to grow back those parts of myself that I felt that I have to cut off, and not just grow back it personally, but grow it back in terms of how I think and how I produce knowledge, that imagination and creativity is part of thinking. And so I am trying to embody that and use it as part of my toolkit, but also study it and to understand and respect. In the same way that I felt my imagination was disrespected or squashed through my training, I am trying to respect in the power it has over us in terms of the way that we all navigate the world. And so, I feel that theoretically we have to center imagination, not as a kind of airy-fairy, thing that,
that over against reason. It's not that.
It's not. So that binary between, reason and imagination, I think we have to understand how even to formulate a question, even to decide a methodology, there are ways in which we are doing all kinds of layers of imagining. Who is this work for? Who is the audience? All types of things. And so I want us to broaden our understanding of how imagination is at play, because as I see it, imagination is a battlefield. And right now, there's several very dominating imaginations that impact all of us. And so if we are not cultivating our own counter-imaginary, then we are beholden to certain kinds of imagination, whether it has to do with economics or politics, that, we have nothing to respond with, right? And so we have to do the work of building up counter-imaginaries as part of this battle.
So I want to pursue that a little bit more, because you mentioned teaching and you're a master teacher, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. But before I do that, say a little bit about The Emperor's New Jeans. I mean, you're working, that project is expansive.
That project is going to be a while. We're going to be talking about that project for a little while, Mr. Chairperson.
What
I'll tell you where
sparked,
that, yes.
No, because those are, it's like four radically different sites.
Yeah.
And it's the global South. Yeah. Am I right?
Yeah, but also the U.S. Yeah, but it's not as expansive as it sounds. When you frame it in terms of countries, what it really is are very discrete initiatives that are working along this science. So it's thinking about how, again, and it ties back to the imagination. So researchers can be working within the same scientific field, but depending on the nation state and the national imaginary that's animating the field of genomics, then different racial and ethnic categories are salient in different sites. And so it frames and it shapes the science. And so, again, it's thinking about how an imagination of what counts socially, what groups matter, and how that's folded into the production of knowledge within fields that are seen as asocial, as universal. Like, no matter where you do this, you're going to get the same results. But that's not what we find. Right. And so, but even stepping back a little bit from that, one of the things that got me interested in this project coming out of the stem cell, the people science work, was I was looking for a place where some form of participatory science was at play. I wanted to study what the alternative would be from the top-down, hype-driven arena where populism was used as a kind of veneer for what was happening, to somewhere where it seemed like researchers were genuinely collaborating with groups who they hoped to study but also hoped to learn with. So that was partly what animated me. Was oftentimes our first projects sometimes are more kind of cynical and critical. Then you're like, I want to study something a little more, in terms of, something good that seems to be happening. Right. Not that you don't find certain other critiques at play, but that's partly what animated that, was to see a place, in this case, it's the first site in terms of South Africa, where researchers there, they saw how scientists from other parts of the world would helicopter in, get DNA samples, fly back out, publish papers, get famous, give a kind of lip service to collaboration. And they wanted to do something differently. As scientists from the world, they wanted to have a different kind of relationship with indigenous groups and so on. And so that was the foray into that, to study what it might look like for participation to happen genuinely. But then again, the different sites is more a matter of thinking about, okay, how is race ethnicity shaping this field? Right. And it's really initiatives. It's not whole countries.
Right. When you see it, you just go,
no, I know.
Whoa.
No, don't be.
So we've talked about the arc of the work from Spelman to Berkeley to people science to captivating technology, race after technology, to the Emperor's New Genes. How does it translate into the classroom and into the public life, in your public life? I mean, and I bring those two together in an interesting sort of way, because when I see you do your TEDx talks, or when you're engaged in your public speaking, or you're still teaching, you're engaging in that pedagogical enterprise. And then I know that the students here at Princeton, flock to your classes and the conferences you put on. Talk a little bit about your philosophy of teaching, and in the various spaces in which you enact it.
So again, it comes out of a kind of stubbornness when someone says, this is what teaching is, this is where teaching happens. I don't agree. I think that that a classroom and a relationship where one is teaching and learning can happen anywhere. Right. And it's not limited to the four corners of the classroom. And so, for example, if I'm on teaching leave and I need teaching to survive, teaching is my mental health program. It's the way that I process the world. So as I'm teaching, it's part of processing. And when I don't have that outlet, I have to create that outlet. And so sometimes it takes the form of holding workshops at the public library, having screenings at the local theater. It has to do with collaborating with various kinds of organizations in and around, Central Jersey, or flying. For example, a few weeks ago, I connected with a group of math teachers in San Francisco. They were from all over the country, but the conference was in San Francisco. Math teachers who are trying to connect math education with social justice. And so for me, it's not simply about me going in to teach, but to connect with educators who are doing all kinds of interesting work. And so in terms of philosophy, most of the time, when I'm in the traditional classroom, my approach to teaching is that one of co-conspiring with my students. We are here to figure out how to understand better and to change for the better. And I teach my students as ambassadors of the material that I'm teaching. I'm trying to give them tools and insights and ways of approaching the world and the material so that they can teach other people. If it only stops with them, to me, it's just so limited. So I'm trying to approach them like, okay, now what are you going to do with it, right? And so, I feel like that it energizes me to know that it is going to have these ripple effects. And then for them, I feel like, as a semester goes, we become not quite peers, but more and more aligned in terms of why we're sitting in that room for a few hours a day. Right. Yeah.
So all of this is happening under concrete material conditions. We often find ourselves being called upon to reflect on the state of the country, the state of the world. Yeah. It's a time of ever-increasing anxiety. And you have to speak to that world. Yeah. And that anxiety is often located in a number of different ways, in a number of different spaces, identifying a number of different things. People are worried about how they're going to keep a roof over their head, how they're going to pay their bills. People are worried about automation, whether or not they're going to lose their jobs. So, look, Amazon just opens up a store where no one is there, right? I mean, so you have all of this insecurity, anxiety tied to a deepening sense or feeling of precarity. Yeah. And you're out there. How do you speak to it? How do you sit with it? How do you organize with others to respond to it?
Part of my reflection on that question, and that is the $1 million question, is to go back to this idea of really coming to grips with our collective power within these systems, which requires... And the word collective is important to me because as individual kind of teachers and professors and intellectuals, I think we shouldn't be the center of attention and prognosis, but it's really about animating certain kinds of connections so that we can develop our collective power to respond to this world that you have described. And I think so one arena, one of the buzzwords of the last year, concerns and anxieties, has been around this whole idea of fake news and science being under attack and the line between what are the facts and what's fake and so on. So again, let's be stubborn. When we're given a choice, it's either this or that. I think our first instinct needs to be, what is the third way, the third path that's not being provided as an option? And if we can't immediately see a third way, let's work together to think about what a third way, a different possibility is besides either this or that. There are either this line between, facts and fiction, or everything is everything. There's no reality. It's all subjective. It's all relative. These are the two ways, a hard and send binary versus everything is everything. What is a third way? What is a different way that we can begin to forge that would give us a better way to actually intervene in this? Because I don't think either one of those are adequate. And so when we are presented with the idea of, okay, so right now, like science being under attack, facts being under attack, one, knee-jerk reaction is to then start policing again the bounds of what counts as science. Let's raise the bar. And what happens with that is that, and what we've seen time and again is the more we police the boundaries of the facts and the science, the possibility of who is inside and outside in terms of demographics, race, class, who can produce those facts is also part of what gets hardened, right? And so certain kinds of inequalities in terms of gender and race, it becomes solidified the more we're trying to become more insular in terms of science. And what I want to suggest is that fictions, the stories that we tell about the world, are a necessary site of knowledge that we have to invest more and we have to respect. And they go hand in hand with what we think of as the hard and true facts. And I'm going to give you a quick example just to illustrate this more abstract point. A couple years ago, a team at Stanford, they wanted to understand how people's understanding of inequities in our carceral system, injustice in our carceral system, how that their understanding of it would lead them to either support or not support certain types of policies and reforms. So they approached people coming off the train station in the Bay Area, and they approached people walking on the streets in New York. And so they presented them with the disparities in terms of the astronomical rate of Black incarceration in both these states. And then in California, they said, okay, you have a sense of these disparities. Would you support reforms in the 3 strikes law in California? In New York, they said, would you support reforms in stop and frisk, right? Now that you understand the disparities. And these were all white Americans. And what they were surprised, I think, to find was that the people who were exposed to the facts were less likely to support the reforms in the three strikes and the stop and frisk. That is, the exposure to the facts did not lead in a straight line to social change in any meaningful way, right? So the question is why? What's lost in translation? And what I would suggest is that the stories we tell about the facts, why that high Black incarceration exists at all, is as important as seeing some kind of statistics about it, right? Because we can tell stories about why there's inherent criminality in this group, so they need to be locked up. In fact, why would we have less three strikes? We need stronger, stricter laws, right? And so just understanding disparities in some flat sense of statistics or graphs is not enough. We have to also invest in the stories and the narratives we're telling as part and parcel of how we begin to develop collective action around social change. And so, again, this is a case for what we know as the buzzword of interdisciplinarity, but I think more meaningfully in terms of knowledge production out in the world, we need our poets, we need our literary folk, we need our storytellers as much as we need our statisticians when it comes to producing data for Black lives.
Absolutely. Well, it seems to me that's a great place to end. I want to thank you, Professor Benjamin, for joining us today with this discussion. I think the takeaway is let's be stubborn.
Yes, let's be stubborn. Let that be the takeaway. Let's put it on a T-shirt.
Additionally, I want to thank Courtney Bryan for providing the music to this broadcast, and to the staff of the Department of African American Studies here at Princeton, our office manager, April Peters, our event coordinator, Dion Worthy, our social media specialist, Allison Bland, and our technical specialist and audio engineer, Elio Leo. Remember, you can find this podcast and more by visiting our website, aas.princeton.edu. Take care.